All right. Hello, everybody. It's me, Michael Leclerc. In case you forgot my face, what I look like. Before we get into week two of the information we're going to be going over, I got a couple housekeeping items I want to go through first. So, first and foremost, this another quick reminder that the quiz for the 11th hour video that I posted last week is going to be due, I guess, tonight at midnight. It's kind of weird for me to think about it this way because I'm making this video before Friday, but I need to keep in mind that since I'm posting it on the Friday, you guys might be seeing it then. So tonight, Friday at midnight, sounds weird for me to think about it that way. That's when the quiz will be due. Friday, January 21st by midnight, it has to be completed. The other thing that I wanted to go over quickly, as the background here probably shows, I want to quickly go over the carbon footprint assignment that will be due shortly. Not due by midnight tonight. So a couple of you have already submitted it. That's fantastic. Really like to see the initiative on that. But I want to make sure I give everybody a fair shake at it, just in case. Excuse me. The actual information that's given in the assignment sheet isn't doesn't, just in case it misses something. You don't know, right? You never know. So I'm just going to go through this quickly. So this is what the website will look like for the carbon footprint that I take you that the link in the assignment will bring you to. As you can see, there's several different tabs. There's house, flights, car, motorbike, blah blah blah. I'm just asking you to fill it out to your best of your ability. I understand that some of you may be renting, like an apartment or a dorm or whatever the case might be, so you might not know, for instance, how much your housing takes up. As you can see in this one here, the electricity, natural gas, that's fine. If you can get estimates of it, fantastic. If you have parents, you can ask what they typically pay, if you want to put that down, or how many kilowatts, not necessarily much they pay, but how much kilowatts they use. By all means, go for that. Flights, I mean, due to COVID, I kind of doubt people have been flying around all over the place. So you could probably get away with leaving this blank. If you have gone on a flight, I mean, this is going to be like, honor system. If you've gone on a flight, then you can include it. If you haven't, then, I mean, you leave it blank, obviously. If you own a car, you put in the mileage for it in kilometerage, I guess. Choose your vehicle type and then just calculate it from there, and that gets added. If you don't own a car, then you can get into the bus and rail section of it. I'm assuming you guys don't necessarily walk literally everywhere you go. If you do, I mean, good for you, I guess. That's probably not an easy thing to do, though. The motorbike, pretty self-explanatory, similar to the car, but in case that instead of having a car, you have a motorbike. Bus and rail, as I said, is your public transport. So if you use a bus or you use a taxi, that includes Ubering. If you use, I guess, the tube, so subway. I don't think that's going to be very common in Barrie, but you never know. And then secondary. So this is going to be pretty much applicable to everybody. This is the big one. So that's going to be your food and drink products, your pharmaceuticals, includes Advil and any sort of medicines you need to take. I don't need specifics, obviously. You can just estimate the amount that you're spending. And then you get your clothes, textiles, and shoes, how much clothes you're buying. Paper-based products, so books, magazines, newspapers, computers and IT equipment, television, radio, and phone, motor vehicles, not including fuel costs. So that could be stuff like getting oil changes, your tires swapped out, stuff like that. If you bought any furniture, if you've gone to hotels, restaurants, or pubs, how much your telephone, mobile, cell phone call costs per year or per month. I think you can adjust this. Banking and financing, so mortgage and loan interest payments. Probably, I mean, who knows? There might be, if you have mortgages, if you have other loan interests, stuff like OSAP even, that can get impacted here. Your education, how much you spend towards college, insurances for different things, then your recreational, cultural, and sporting activities. It just estimates it. So this is obviously going to be a ballpark figure. A lot of this stuff, I'm expecting, like, if, for instance, if you play hockey, you might not know exactly how much you spent on your equipment, for instance. Just do your best guess with it, and that's all I'm asking for. And after that's finished, you'll get something that looks roughly like this. This is just kind of like obviously the number here is, I mean, it's kind of just going to be tailored to whatever you ended up putting in for each individual section. And this is essentially what I'm looking for. Please include a picture of this. however you want. You can actually do snipping on if you have a if you have a Windows computer. I'm not as familiar with Apple or Linux or any of the other types, so I'm not sure how you can do with those. I mean, if worst comes to worst, just take a picture with your phone. I'll make do with that if you need to do that. And then just send that in with the like attached to your little document uh, detailing your what you thought about your carbon footprint. If you have ideas on how to improve it, or basically what your thoughts were on it, and that's essentially the assignment. Hopefully that makes a little bit more clear. Shouldn't take you guys hopefully too long to get through this. As you can see, like it's just a couple of tabs. You're just filling in the numbers, and for the most part, they're not like terribly difficult to get, except for probably the housing one notwithstanding. But if you have any questions, of course, always I'm available for that. You can reach out to me, and I'll do my best to help you out. There was a couple cases too where people were having trouble downloading the actual video, or not the video, sorry, the assignment link, clicking the link and actually getting the assignment onto their computer. If you're also running into that problem, please let me know, because maybe it's something on my end. Maybe I put it onto Blackboard incorrectly. So just let me know if you're having that problem as well. And that's basically it for that. So I guess without further ado, we can start getting into the actual assignment, or not the assignment, rather, the actual presentation for this week. Actually, you know what? Scratch that. That reminds me. Couple last housekeeping items. So first off, I'm going to be having my first office hours on Monday. So Monday, January 24th. My office hours are going to be 7 to 9 p.m. So I do have a document, a Word document that I've linked and posted on Blackboard. It's under the weekly learning section. Should be right down at the bottom underneath the folders for the weeks. And you can just click on that and you can just pop your name in there for a time slot if you want. That way I have an idea of, who I'm going to be speaking with, and even a topic if you want to put that down, so I have an idea of what we're going to be talking about. That's more just so I can prepare if I need to, not, flying in there blind necessarily. But if you don't want to put it down, I mean, sure, we can do that too. I'm pretty easygoing on that. I want to stress too that if it comes down to a lot of these time slots getting taken up, then we're going to have to be mindful of each other's times. So for instance, if I'm with one of you and the 20 minutes is up and it's somebody else's time, we're going to have to cut that meeting short to start the next person's, just to be conscious of everybody's time slots. If we didn't get to everything you wanted to talk about, we can continue via email. We can set up another meeting, like the following one-on-one, if you really want to go over it again, or we can even just, oh, sorry. You might see my cats jump up at one point or another. They're kind of attention whores sometimes. But that's basically it for the office hours. Just if you want, you can sign up for it, just 20-minute block. If nobody's signing up and you really have something you need to go over, you could probably pump in 2 slots if you really want to. But keep in mind, if it does start becoming busier, I'll let you know that we might need to take out one of those slots, for instance, to let somebody else take it if needed. So let's just stick with the one for now, though. However, let's get into environmental concerns for week 2. So what are we going to be learning about this week? Well, if you are like me and take a look at the syllabus, you're going to see that we're going to be working on the following things: biodiversity, ecology, and human population. I've set up this presentation, if you will, in such a way where this is like the table of contents, essentially, right? This is where we're starting off, and this is the table of contents. You got your 3 topics. So if at any point you guys are studying for, say, a midterm or the final or something, and you need to refer back to this presentation, you can use this table of contents and the associated title slides, I guess, if you want to call them something, to have a rough idea of where things are in relation to what you're looking for. So biodiversity. What is biodiversity, right? Why do we care about biodiversity? This is an environmental concerns course, so it should be no surprise to you that it's about concerning the environment. So what is biodiversity, first off? Well, simply put, biodiversity is just the amount of diversity or variety that makes up a biome. So it's done by taking into account the number of species as well as their commonness in this area. It can be used to take stock of how healthy an environment is. So the more species, the better, generally speaking, but that's not always the case. For instance, a rainforest, which has thousands, if not millions, of different species when you get into like bacteria and everything, just thriving in this area, then that's obviously going to have much more life or species in it than like the Arctic, right? Doesn't mean the Arctic's not healthy. It just means that there's less species in the Arctic. The way that they generally look at this is you compare one biome to the same type of biome. So you wouldn't compare a rainforest to the Arctic. You'd compare a rainforest to another rainforest, for instance, to see how the biodiversity is between those. So what are biomes? Well, we've got 7 of them here. We've got the coniferous forest, we've got the desert, grassland, rainforest, shrubland, temperate, deciduous forest, and a tundra. So the coniferous forest is kind of something that you have probably seen before. They're found in Canada. Surprise, surprise. They're found in Europe, Asia, and the United States. Their temperatures can range anywhere from, as it shows here, minus 40 degrees Celsius to about 20 degrees Celsius. They get a fair amount of rain through the year too, as you're seeing there, around 300 to 900 millimeters. Mostly consists of conifers. If you're not sure what a conifer is, the next little section there tells you it's the trees that grow needles. So your pines, your evergreens, those kind of things. The trees we just took out of our living rooms a short little while ago for Christmas. Those are your conifers. Next up, we have the desert. So interestingly, the desert has a pretty wide range of temperatures as well, even though most of it is positive, as you can see. It does average about 38 degrees Celsius during the day, but it does drop into the negatives over the night. And it does get a little bit of rain, but obviously, as you're seeing from the last one, which got 300 to 900 in the coniferous, deserts are really only getting about 250 over the entire year. It shows here that they're generally found between 15 and 35 degrees latitude, and examples of these are the Sahara Desert, the Mojave Desert, and the Gobi Desert. So they are the driest of all the biomes. The large fluctuations in temperature between day and night is because the air is so dry that heat escapes rapidly at night. It can't like maintain its moisture. There's like no humidity actually in the desert. So any heat that is gained in the air and stayed in the air basically evaporates is the wrong word, but just leaves as soon as nighttime comes and it gets to those negative temperatures. Obviously not a place you'd want to find yourself. Next up, we got the grasslands. So they are a little dependent on latitude as far as the temperature is concerned. So they can range anywhere between minus 20 degrees Celsius to 30 degrees Celsius. They do get much more rain than the desert. They get about 500 to 900 millimeters. Still kind of in the same range as the coniferous forest that we were speaking about earlier. The Great Plains of North America or the Veldt of South Africa are great examples of grasslands. If you can try and picture them in your heads, they're generally those open and continuous, fairly flat areas of grass. The grass can actually vary in length from over 2 meters in height to only 20 to 25 centimeters tall, so quite a big variation there. The height of the grass actually corresponds with how much rainfall is receiving in that area. If you've seen Game of Thrones, the Dothraki, was it the grasslands or something? Like, what do they call it? The Sea of Grass or something? In the first season, that's actually kind of like a grassland right there for you. More extreme one, but that is one. Fake one, but that's one. Next up, we got the rainforest. The precipitation, notwithstanding, is gigantic. It's ginormous even compared to basically every other biome, which is no surprise really, because I mean it says rain in the name of the place, right? The temperature is probably not as hot as you would think, considering it's a rainforest, only the 20 to 25 degrees. We've dealt with hotter even here in Canada, but it needs to remain warm and frost-free. Pretty self-explanatory too, just the life forms that are found in a rainforest. You don't think many of them are going to adapt or do well if there's frost forming or frost anywhere, right? They're typically located between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. And there are 2 types of rainforests. You have your tropicals and your temperate ones. The tropical ones are the ones that are found closer to the equator, where it is warm, and there's a hot, moist biome that rains all year long. So that's your 2,000 to 10,000 millimeters of rain per year. Temperate rainforests are found near the cooler coastal areas. They're further north or south of the equator. Next up, we have our shrublands. They're hot and dry in the summer, and they're cool and moist in the winter. Pretty self-explanatory there. They get a decent amount of rain, 200 to 1,000 millimeters. They're located in Southern California, southwestern parts of Africa, and Australia. Regions are usually found surrounding deserts and grasslands, and they're made up of shrubs and short trees. Typically not enough consistent rain, though, to support tall trees, which is why we're only seeing those shrubs and their shorties. And then finally, well, not finally, sorry, there's two more left. We got the temperate deciduous forest. You're pretty familiar with these as well. These are your deciduous trees, so your maples, your oaks, those types of trees, the big boys. They're very popular. The Canadian artists that went up north and they did all the famous paintings. What is it? I can't remember the name of them now. It's gonna make me feel stupid, but the deciduous forests are famous for the four seasons. So they're the ones that have the changing colors and leaves, right? They kind of go through the different aspects throughout the seasons. You have the color change in the autumn, all the leaves fall off in the winter, and then everything grows back during the spring. And then finally, we have the tundra. An easy way of thinking about the tundra is actually that they are kind of like the opposite of a desert in a way. Whereas the desert is very hot and very dry, the tundra is very cold, but also kind of dry in an interesting way. So as you can see, they actually get the least amount of precipitation out of all the biomes. If you recall, you can even rewind a little bit if you want to look at it again. Desert actually got 250 millimeters of rain per year. Tundra is actually 150 to 250. So these are your Arctic circle places. This is the ice caps, the coldest areas of the biomes. The places where you're going to find your penguins, you're going to find your polar bears, that kind of stuff. The reason that it's kind of different than the desert in terms of the rain that it's getting is because the tundra is actually still considered pretty wet still. The reason for that is because since there's such low temperatures, it causes the evaporation of water to be very slow. If you think about it, on a hot summer day, if you pour some water on the pavement or you just pour water somewhere, it evaporates pretty quickly. It doesn't happen over here in the tundra. So because of that, much of the Arctic, for instance, has a rain and fog in the summers, and water actually gathers in bogs and ponds and such like that. So back to kind of one of my original questions, why should we care about diversity? How diverse the biome's environment is can be used as a thermometer test of how healthy it is. So biodiversity is compared to similar biomes or historical data, as I said. And this kind of goes in with what I mentioned earlier. There's no sense comparing a tundra to a rainforest. One clearly has many more species in it. If we look at long-term trends over time, we can indicate how a biome is doing. Are populations increasing? Are they decreasing? Are they disappearing entirely? Are new species showing up? Do we have invasive species showing up? Populations increasing doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing, though. If you have too many predators, for instance, it can completely eradicate a prey species, for instance. And that's obviously not good either, because now you just eliminated first off, a prey species that the predator might have needed to survive, but you're also just eliminating a species entirely, which is probably not a good thing either. Another important thing is, how are new species showing up? Are they showing up by boat, hopping on a plane? I mean, those are actually possible things that can happen. That's how some invasive species get on to be invasive in the areas they go to. Or are they showing up by other means? Maybe there's a case where these are a lot rarer, obviously, but you have some sort of geographical occurrence where, say, there's a split in the earth or mountain ranges form or something and populations get divided up. It's important to keep that in mind because new species showing up completely throws off the balance of things. So as I said, why should we care about why should we care about biodiversity? Our Earth is made up of so many different processes and chains and webs and links, and although the collapse of one may not spell doom and gloom, cascading effects are a real concern. So there's these things called keystone species. And a keystone species is an organism that helps define an entire ecosystem. Without a keystone species, the ecosystem would be dramatically different or cease to exist altogether. Keystone species usually have low functional redundancy. Basically, that means that their niche or the thing that they do is pretty, not rare is probably the wrong word, but there's not a lot of other species in that ecosystem that do it as well. So and actually a decent example of it is a beaver. How many species do you know that create dams? The beaver is actually considered like a habitat creator. By making these dams, they're responsible for creating lakes, canals, wetlands. They irrigate large forests. They create ecosystems. So if you were to just eliminate the beavers through like a predator, or we came in and just, shot all the beavers, for instance, that could potentially destroy ecosystems. And then everything that was dependent on that ecosystem just dies off as well. There's a good example of it. There's this picture here of a sea otter. So back in the 17th century, sea otters were hunted extensively for their pelts, which caused a cascade effect. One of the sea otter's primary sources of food is the sea urchin. Sea otter populations declined so much from this hunting that the sea urchin population boomed. There was no sea otters anymore to eat them. And these sea urchins began overexploiting their main food source, the kelp. This kind of created what were called urchin barrens, where virtually no life existed except for the sea urchins. But then the sea urchins had no food either because they had eaten all the kelp. So they also went locally extinct as well. So then you keep in mind also that these kelp forests were ecosystems which were home to a lot of other species. The loss of the kelp ultimately led to the extinction of all these animals as well. And when I say local extinction, that means that just in that local area. So when I say like sea urchins became locally extinct, doesn't mean there's no sea urchins anywhere in the world anymore. I mean, if you've gone down to the Caribbean or something, I'm sure you've seen sea urchins when you're scuba diving or snorkeling or something. But in that local area where the hunting was being conducted, sea urchins basically went locally extinct, as well as everything that was in those kelp forests, until they kind of went back on that. People were eventually like, oh, I mean, we're kind of killing all the sea otters. We probably shouldn't do that. And it took a bit of a concerted effort, but sea otters started making a comeback, which was good. So next up, we got ecology. Okay. So what is ecology? Well, ecology is the study of organisms and how they interact with the environment around them. How do organisms interact with the living and non-living factors around them? So this is not only taking into account like how a predator interacts with its prey, or how a prey interacts with like a herbivore interacts with another herbivore, or how bacteria interacts with a larger animal. It's a very complicated subject that can start taking into effect the environments. How does some predator find it a home to live in, its cave or its den? How is the sun impacting like the plants and stuff? It's a very, very complicated subject that you can break down infinitely. It's the foods they eat, the predators, the diseases, homes, environments, etc., etc., etc. So what do they need to survive? What happens if an ecosystem is not functioning normally? What can cause an ecosystem to not function normally? Some of these subjects we're going to start dealing with more further down along the line, but I thought this was a decent chance to kind of whet our appetite, if you will, with some of these topics. So the first thing I'm going to look at is some of the interactions that some of these species can interact in. There's 5 main ways. We have mutualism, commensalism, competition, predation, and parasitism. The first one is mutualism that we're going to go over. And so, as the name kind of suggests, both species will benefit from the interaction. It's either one of 2 forms of mutualism. You have either an obligate or you have a facultative. So an obligate, both species involved cannot survive without the relationship. If one species basically leaves, the other species will die off because its partner is gone. And in a facultative, both species can survive without the relationship, but often not as well. I mean, the relationship is probably there for a reason, and that reason usually is that it benefits both of them. So with one of them gone, it still does okay, but it could be better. So leafcutter ants and certain fungi have an obligate mutualistic relationship. And the way that explained is just below, where it says the ant larvae only eat one specific kind of fungi. The fungi cannot survive without the constant care of the ants. So as a result, colony activities revolve around protecting and cultivating this fungi so that they can feed it to their larvae. So without the ants, the fungi would die because they can't survive without them. And without the fungi, the ants cannot feed their babies, their larvae, and they would die. Next up, we have commensalism. So in this one species benefits and the other is unaffected. This is kind of an example of, one's hanging around and getting good benefit from it, and the other dude's just like, okay, well, you can hang out. Good example of this, speaking of hanging out, is orchids. So orchids found in the rainforest may be found growing and clinging to the branches of trees in order to access sunlight. But I mean, they're just hanging on a tree, right? They're hanging on the branches, but that doesn't affect the tree at all. Obviously, it's beneficial for the orchids because they're getting the sunlight now. They're up higher, but that's not affecting the tree at all. The tree doesn't care. It's not like the orchids are heavy or weighing down their branches or anything. They're not sapping resources. But it can be difficult to identify these relationships because sometimes the individual that benefits may have some indirect or hard to quantify benefits on the other individual that aren't really noticeable or detectable. And we have competition. So competition can get complicated. There's 3 different types. There's interference, there's exploitation, and there's apparent competition. In competition, both species are affected negatively. They're normally considered the interaction when there's like a common resource that's in a limited supply. So they're kind of butting heads over that resource. I'm going to briefly go over the 3 types of competitions. So the first one we have here is interference. When an individual prevents others from getting a resource, that's the interference part of it. They're basically standing in the way and saying no. And this does not necessarily, it's important to state too with this that this is like interrelationships between, it could be either like, animals within the same species, like in the example that I'm about to show you, or different species entirely. That like the relationships do not have to necessarily be between different species. They can totally be within the same species. I mean, even us as humans, right? We're guilty probably of all of these different types of relationships, in competition, commensalism, parasitism. We're involved with all of them at one point or another or somehow. In this one here, a male gorilla prevents other males from accessing a mate by using physical aggression or displays of aggression. The dominant male is altering the mating behavior of the other males by preventing that mating, right? So that's interference. He's just basically saying, nah, you're not getting anywhere near the females. Exploitation competition. This occurs normally when individuals interact indirectly by competing for the same resource. So the use of the resource by one species or individual reduces the amount available for the other species or individual. So this is like, you're going down to the cafeteria to get some food. Somebody's already taken all the good stuff. There's nothing left for you, right? That was exploitation competition. You got there too late, or, the early bird gets the worm kind of mentality. Over time, that exploitation and interference can create a superior competitor, it's called. This superior competitor eliminates an inferior one from an area, resulting in competitive exclusion. Basically meaning that if you use the gorilla example again, the other male gorillas that have no access to the females, they have only 2 options. They either die or they leave and go to another like camp or group to find another female. That's really all they have to do. Right? I mean, I guess there's a third option if you want to include fighting, but I'm kind of like an actual physical altercation, but that's a whole other thing. And then there's the last one, apparent competition. So this occurs when 2 individuals that do not directly compete for resources affect each other indirectly by being prey for the same predator. So this is kind of like a difficult to identify nature one, but it's also kind of like a funny one to think about in a way. So in this example here, think about a hawk that preys on squirrels and mice. If the squirrel population increases for whatever reason, say there's a lot more of the resource they eat, so they're just having babies like crazy, the mouse population may also be positively affected, since now there's a lot more squirrels to be caught by the hawks, right? The hawks are going to hone in and say, well, for every mouse I'm seeing 13 squirrels or something. But as more squirrels start getting hunted now, could also mean a higher hawk population. They put out the bird call saying, hey, there's a lot of squirrels over here. All the more hawks will start showing up to start eating. It's not actually a bird call for it, but you know what I mean. Birds will go where the prey is. So more hawks will appear to eat these squirrels. As the squirrels are killed, their population is going to start declining, obviously, as they're decimated essentially. But now the mouse population is at risk, probably at a greater risk, because now their numbers haven't really increased. They didn't get like the whatever boon it was that caused the squirrels to increase. But now there's like how many more hawks to deal with? Not a great situation for the mice. So as I said, it's kind of difficult to identify in nature since it's quite complex. It requires many indirect interactions that involve multiple species and changing environmental conditions. Predation, as you can assume, one species benefits and the other is pretty negatively affected. It's usually a pretty negative experience for the species that gets eaten in these scenarios. But it's not just limited to preying on other animals. Herbivores are preying on plants as well. Eating them is still considered kind of a form of predation. The only major difference between predation and what's called herbivory is that herbivory doesn't always result in the death of the prey individual, right? If a lion goes to a gazelle and eats it, the gazelle's dead. If, a rabbit goes and starts eating some leaves, it's not necessarily killing the bush. It's just eating a couple leaves and then the plant can regrow. So animals also have their own kind of fascinating evolutionary arms race between predators and prey, just ways that they're trying to stay ahead of each other. Because at the end of the day, even though that's kind of the totem pole, the prey gets eaten by the predators and then the predators get eaten by the higher predators and so on, they don't want that, right? The prey want to live. So adaptations typically of predators involve sharp teeth and claws, involve camouflage, poison, stingers, quick and agile bodies to kind of navigate quickly and get the jump on animals. And then they also usually have great senses of smell and sight for hunting themselves. And then adaptations that are more typical of prey, they also have camouflage. They also have chemical defenses, so those are like your skunks, for instance, behavioral ones, and life developmental. Examples of behavioral and life developmental in particular, behavioral would be like forming herds. If you see like bison forming herds and circling around each other to protect, the young, that's behavioral. Something life developmental would be like using the gazelle as an example. If you've ever seen human babies, we can't give birth to a human baby and it's running around within minutes of birth. Gazelles can do that because they basically have their child and then it's like, well, we might have a predator on us any minute. You got to be able to take care of yourself. That's a life developmental adaptation. And then finally we have parasitism. So in this one species benefits while the other is negatively affected. It's kind of similar to predation, but the difference in a way is that parasites can be found inside or outside the host body. When they're inside, it's called endoparasites, and when it's outside, it's ecto. Parasites typically don't kill their hosts. However, the parasitic relationship can leave the host vulnerable to illness or lower health in general, which can lead to death. So why don't parasites kill the host? I mean, it kind of defeats the purpose, right? You went through the trouble of finding this nice big host to feed off of. Why kill and have to start all over again? Lower health can result in increased predation potential as well. Just wanted to add in there. The final part of this is food webs. So you're probably seen these before in high school and other, during your educational journey. But this is a pretty simplified look at it. So we have our decomposers at the very bottom, our earthworms. You have your producers, which are your plants. They gather energy from the sun. And then you have your herbivores, your predators, and your apex predators up at the top. The apex predators, they're pretty unique in that what an apex predator means is that there's nothing above them, kind of as the list shows. Examples of apex predators are wolves, I guess even hawks and foxes in this case, animals that don't get hunted by something else in their environment. As humans, we've actually had some pretty unique interactions with apex predators through our history. We took wolves and we domesticated into dogs. We've used birds of prey. You've seen, them hatching onto people's arms, and we use them to hunt game animals. More recently, we've started introducing new interactions with basically all of these layers of the food web, with new interactions such as ecotourism and through rewilding efforts. So that's the idea of zoos where we'll bring in some animals to try and get them repopulating and then hopefully bring them back out into the wild. Just rewilding efforts to increase populations, prevent extinctions. But ecotourism is an interesting one. It's a form of tourism where you travel to a natural area to interact with it in order to educate the traveler, to provide funds for conservation, or just directly benefit the economic development of local communities, or just to foster respect. When I went to Australia years ago, I actually went on a tour to go see the glowworms. So again, obviously not an apex predator, But it did involve a very long bus ride out into the jungle, because that's kind of what you have to do, right? They take you to the animal you're going to go see. It's actually a really cool experience. They had us walking through the jungle at night, because if you want to see the glowworms, they only glow at night, right? They had us turn off all our lights and everything because they didn't want us to get the attention of other animals. And at one point, one person actually turned on the light on their phone, started screaming. So at that point, the tour guide was trying to hush everybody. And that just got more people turning their lights on. And when we noticed, remember this is Australia, more people started turning their lights on. We saw there was giant spiders everywhere hanging down, like from the trees and stuff. I'm not like scared of spiders or anything, but that was an experience. I really quickly wanted to see the glowworms and get out of there. Let's put it that way, because everything's poisonous in Australia. Everything's a lot bigger too. They were huge spiders. So this third part is the human population, the third part of our discussion that we're going to be talking about. Before I get into it quickly, I wanted to point out too, because I actually forgot to mention it, I am making a worksheet. It is not worth marks. There's no mandatory requirement to do it or anything, but I will be pulling from that for the midterm and for the final. It's just one page and it has a couple definitions that you can fill in and a couple short answers, even though the midterm and the final are multiple choice. But I just want to provide you guys with a way to take some notes if you want, to keep some information handy. It's just a good study tool if you want to utilize it. If you don't, that's fine, but it's there for you, those of you who want to use it. And without further ado, let's get into the final section here, human population. This is the big section too, so don't think that we're almost through this. If you look down at the little time span thing or whatever on the meeting or on the presentation, I'm sure we got quite a ways to go still. So this course is about questioning everything. Cycles of the planet, disease, and human impact on our environment. The planet has shown us many checks and balances in its evolution. But we're looking at here the population and the human impact on the planet. In order to understand the Earth's ability to maintain human impact on the planet, we must first study the past, the present, and the projected future population growth. So the first question that probably comes to your guys' mind is, how many people can the Earth sustain? Like, realistically, how many people can live on this Earth? And what changes must we make as humans to keep our planet Earth healthy? That kind of goes back to our biodiversity that we were talking about earlier. If we don't keep the planet healthy, it's not going to be able to protect us or keep us safe, right? The healthier the planet is, the bigger its carrying capacity, if you will be in order to hold a larger population of us. Planet has shown us that it does have checks and balances as it evolves. It's very evident in the life expectancy of people as they evolved as well. We have a higher medical understanding. There's war and childbearing. All these things were serious hazards, as we're going to discuss, that constantly control the rise and fall of population through the years. So an important lesson that a lot of civilizations even learn is learn from the past, learn from past mistakes, learn from past successes. That's an important thing that we're going to be going through, and just an important thing to learn in general. So very quickly, the definition of evolution. It's the gradual development of something, especially from a simple to a more complex form. Several different synonyms included here. There's development, advancement, growth, rise, progress, progression. All of those are different synonyms that work with evolution. So if you think about 10,000 years ago, the world's population was estimated, because we don't know for sure, there's not like a book out there that says there were this many people back in 10,000 years ago, but it was estimated to be about 5 million. 5 million people. Think about that. So while a census of the nation was not completed until 1790, the U.S. Census Bureau estimates that there were about 2.5 million people living in the United States, original 13 states in 1776. Since then, the nation has grown to more than 300 million people. And then 200 years ago, there were less than 1 billion humans living on Earth. Today, we are at approximately 7.7 billion. If you take that back to that 10,000, think about it this way. I always liken the difference between millions and billions in seconds. So 1 million seconds is 11.5 days. 1 billion seconds is 31.5 years. Okay, that's the difference we're talking about here, days and years. So if you take that same difference here, 10,000, or I mean, sorry, 5 million and 7.7 billion, right? 5 million is the equivalent to 57.5 days, whereas that 7.7 billion would be the equivalent to 242.5 years. It's crazy. We're like 5 million isn't even like, what is it? It's like a sixth of a year versus 242 years. So the world population was estimated to have reached 7.7 billion as of November 2018. As I said, it took over 200,000 years of human history for the world's population to reach 1 billion, but it only took 200 years more to reach 7 billion. So our growth rate is staggering, and it kind of shows here. So the red line here is the growth rate, and the blue filled in section is our world population increasing over time. Obviously, this light blue section is projection, because clearly we're not living in 2060 or 2100. But as you can see, we grew pretty slowly for the most of our existence on Earth. Scientists currently estimate that modern human beings evolved around 130,000 to 160,000 years ago. It's kind of a side note, but it always interested me that if you went back far enough in time, there were multiple human species running around interacting with each other. At the time when Homo sapiens, so us, arrived on the scene, there may have been as many as 4 other human beings or human species living. I might be butchering the names of these, but there's the Homo naledi, the Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus, and Homo neanderthalensis. If you go back in time further, there's even more human-like species that existed throughout history. In total, depending on who you talk to, there was as many as 20 other species that evolved and eventually died out or mingled with others. It's interesting to think that even though we're Homo sapiens too, it's said that as much as 2% of the average European's DNA comes from Neanderthals. And I know there's probably some sort of joke in there somewhere. So why has the human population grown slowly for most of its existence? Smart as we are, it was mostly our own ignorance that kept our life expectancy down, limited our growth rate. Some of it was outside of our control, though, at the time. We had diseases and climate change fluctuations primarily among them. Fortunately for us, though, early humanity tended to be a hunter-gatherer society, so we were always on the move, chasing after mammoths and other creatures to eat. This actually leads to another interesting little fact. It might be useless, so if it's not interesting to you, you can skip ahead, but I found it interesting nonetheless. If you were to think about who would win in a race, a horse or a human, you'd probably very likely be inclined to think the horse, right? I mean, we ride them for a reason. Turns out, if the race is long enough, humans will usually win. We're probably the undisputable kings and queens of long-distance running. So why is that important? When we hunted animals back in the prehistoric era, it's not like we could outrun our prey or capture it like we were a tiger or a jaguar or something. We had to depend on our brains mostly, yes, for creating weapons like spears, throwing rocks, things like that. But we still had to get close enough to the animal to actually use that. Our bodies are excellent for prolonged running, more so than pretty much any other species. So think about how terrifying this must have been for animals. Think about how terrifying of a hunter we must have been back in the prehistoric era. A mammoth might see a human hunting it, and the herd runs. It runs, and it runs across the plains as far as it possibly can. It's exhausted and lies down. Rests for a short while, eventually they turn, there's the human again, still coming. So the mammoth runs again, and continues running, again. But every time it looks over its shoulders, there's the human, still slowly chasing, never giving up, never giving in. But as the mammoth begins to get tired, human starts getting closer until the human finally captures that mammoth. Be terrifying. It's like a Terminator, essentially. A predator that seemingly has endless stamina and is always right behind you. It's probably no surprise also to learn that we hunted the mammoth into extinction. So quickly going over that part again. As I said, I just basically regurgitating what I just said, we had many threats that prevented our population from growing quickly, such as diseases and climate fluctuations. It wasn't until the industrial era really happened that our population really boomed. You can see there's this big uptick right in here too. So as you can see, it greatly accelerated growth rates in the 1900s seem to be projected much lower in the future. Right? What caused the massive spike of population growth from around the 1940s to about 2000? Most of the growth is located in two big upticks. You have the 1940s where it really picks up. That's that big, steeper slope there. And the 1970s, again, another big slope increase there. That's roughly where the 2.1% is. First one is the baby boomers. Everybody came home from World War II, and I guess they had basically one thing on their mind. You can see an increase actually also at the end of World War I, which is roughly around 1920 area, because it ended in 1918. And then the second big one in the 1970s is actually the millennials, the babies born from the baby boomers themselves. It kind of makes sense that the biggest surge in population would also have a giant growth rate once they begin having kids of their own. But we can't sustain an endless increase in our population. Our planet only has so much room, so many resources. With the current trends, our population will grow much more slowly in the future, just as this graph shows. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Maybe it's neither. Since growth rate is a percentage, even though the growth rate has decreased, there is still a substantial increase in the world population year by year just because there's so many more people on the planet. If we want to use an extreme example to kind of illustrate that, a growth rate of 100%, the population of 1,000 people would see them double to 2,000 people. However, a 1% growth rate of 1 billion people would add 10 million people to that group. So until fairly recently, little information existed about how long prehistoric people lived. Having access to too few fossilized human remains made it difficult for historians to estimate the demographics of any population. Anthropology professors Rachel Kaspari and Sang-Hee Lee of Central Michigan University and the University of California, respectively, chose instead to analyze the relative ages of skeletons found in archaeological digs in Eastern and Southern Africa, Europe, and elsewhere. So relative age just compares the skeletons in an archaeological dig by putting things in sequential order by comparing it to something else, maybe another skeleton or an artifact at that dig site. You won't get exact ages of things, that's not the point, but you will be able to tell relatively to each other what is older or younger than the other stuff. So after comparing the proportion of those who died young with those who died at an older age, the team concluded that longevity only began to significantly increase, that is, survival past the age of 30. 30 is what we're talking about here, or so, about 30,000 years ago, which is quite late in the span of human evolution. So in an article published in 2011 in Scientific American, Kaspari calls the shift the evolution of grandparents, as it marks the first time in human history that 3 generations might have coexisted. Which is kind of funny to think about, right? With a life expectancy of 30, that kind of makes sense, right? I mean, you would have your kid, I mean, if we're going as early as you possibly can here, like 16 or something, and then that kid would start having their kid around 16, that makes you 32 already instantly. So, and you'd be a grandpa or a grandma. The life expectancy at birth, a figure dramatically influenced by infant mortality, is described as the rate of infant death, which was as high as 30%. However, this does not mean that the average person living in 1200 AD, looking back at that age expectancy of around 30, doesn't mean that they died at the age of 35. It just means that instead, for every child that died in infancy, so at 0, there might have been another person that might have lived to see their 70th birthday. Extremes on either end, right? But that averages out to that 35. Early years up to about the age of about 15 continue to be perilous. That's mostly thanks to risks posed by disease, injuries, and accidents. People who survived up to 15 usually would see their life expectancy dramatically increase afterwards, meaning that they could well make it into old age. I will say, though, that being 70 back in like that time period was probably quite rare. There are other infectious diseases like cholera, tuberculosis, and smallpox, which would go on to limit lifespan, but not on a scale quite as damaging as that of the bubonic plague in the 14th century. The Black Plague, as it was also known, moved through Asia and Europe and wiped out as much as a third of Europe's population, temporarily shifting life expectancy down. This presentation will be available on Blackboard as well, just in its natural state. So you can actually click on each of these links, which would bring you, as you can see, to a little overview of each of them sites, or each of those diseases, if you're interested. So the Black Death, bubonic plague of the 1400s. Obviously devastating. You're probably familiar with it to a decent extent, just through, your educational experience through life so far. You've probably gone over it in one of your classes. It was devastating. Global epidemic that struck Europe and Asia in the mid-1300s, continued into the 1400s. Plague arrived in Europe in continued into the 1400s. In the mid-1300s, around 1347, as it said, it arrived in Europe, when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. People gathered at the docks were met with a horrifying surprise. Most of the sailors aboard the ships were dead, and those still alive were gravely ill and covered in black boils. These were called the bubae, I think, which is characteristic of the bubonic plague. The authorities very quickly ordered the fleet of these death ships, as they were called, out back into the harbor, but it was too late by that point. Over the next 5 years, the Black Death would kill more than 20 million people in Europe, which is basically a third of the population of that continent. It was terrifyingly, indiscriminately contagious, and it was also terrifyingly efficient. So some of the symptoms typically consisted of a fever, painful aching joints, nausea and vomiting, buboes in the groin, neck, and armpits, and a general feeling of malaise. So first off, if you're wondering what malaise means, just means feeling generally unwell. And if you're wondering where buboes are, they're basically inflamed lymph nodes. So you'd have inflamed lymph nodes in the groin, neck, and armpits. The disease very likely originated on infected fleas that traveled on the black rats that lived on these ships. However, once it was out in the public, the disease could spread from person to person. The importance of hygiene was kind of non-existent back in the 1400s. It was actually kind of gross. Remember, we didn't have, plumbing or, wastewater pipes. We didn't have, water being delivered too, so you couldn't take like a hot shower most of the time. People were throwing their fecal matter basically and their waste out onto the streets. Live animals were basically everywhere, and parasites were abound in common. So frankly speaking, this was kind of a perfect storm for the bubonic plague, just to march through Europe and Asia. The 1400s, when the bubonic plague actually hit, were not kind to the human population. Black Death was actually the second great natural disaster to strike Europe. First was that we had what was called the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. It was estimated to have killed 10 to 25 of the population of many cities and towns itself before the bubonic plague even moved in. And as you can see in the last point here, bubonic plague would kill its victims between 2 to 7 days after the initial infection. So it was a very short period. From 1500 to 1800, the life expectancy throughout Europe basically hovered between 30 and 40 years of age. Again, what that basically means is not that once you hit 30 or 40, you just died. It means that that's the average, right? So life expectancy at birth has doubled in a period of only 10 or so generations. That's frankly due to improved healthcare, sanitation, immunizations, access to clean running water, and better nutrition. Without that stuff, our life expectancy at birth would be basically the same. Though it's hard to imagine, doctors only began regularly washing their hands before surgery in the mid-1800s. This is actually kind of a fascinating story. So imagine here the year was 1846, and it was the start of the golden age of the physician scientist. So what do I mean by that? Doctors were meant to have scientific training. So yes, before then, doctors would look to illnesses as some sort of imbalance caused by bad air or evil spirits. Yes, 1846 doesn't seem that long ago that our medical professionals would be leaning so heavily on such weird and frankly wrong ideas. However, it is what it is. But as I said, 1846 is when things began to turn around. They looked to anatomy now. Science was beginning to reign as king. Autopsies were becoming much more common as physicians tried to become more familiar with the human body to try and figure out how it ticked. There was a man, as I said, his name was Semmelweis. He was no different. He showed up to his brand spanking new job at the General Hospital in Vienna, And he started collecting data on why so many women in the maternity ward were dying from puerperal fever, something more commonly known at the time as childbed fever. He studied 2 maternity wards in the hospital. One was staffed by all male doctors and medical students, and the other was staffed by female midwives. And he counted the deaths in each ward. When he crunched the numbers, which, admittedly, probably wasn't very hard because it's just 2 columns, right? Deaths in Ward 1 and deaths in Ward 2. But crunch them he did, and he discovered that the clinic run by the male doctors and medical students had women dying at a rate nearly 5 times higher than the women in the midwives clinic. But why? What was different between the two? So he started researching, he started examining, started watching. One big thing he noticed was that the midwives clinic had women give birth on their sides, while the doctor's clinic had them give birth on their back. So have the women give birth on their sides, he said, and the doctors started doing that. Results? No difference. Then he started noticing another difference. Whenever someone died of childbed fever, a priest would walk slowly through the doctor's clinic, past the women's bed with an attendant, ringing a bell. Surely the priest and the bell ringing was terrifying the women that they developed a fever, got sick, and died. He forced the priest to take a different route and ditch the bell. No effect. He's getting frustrated at this point, so Semmelweis took a leave, and he traveled the city. Hopefully clearing his head would help. When he returned, there was sad but important news waiting for him. One of his colleagues, a pathologist is someone who examines bodies and body tissue, had fallen ill and died. Hopefully hearing about all of these deaths happening in the story is also kind of illustrating part of the reason why our age expectancy was just so low back then. Anyways, dying from illness was quite common for pathologists. In this case, he had pricked his finger doing an autopsy on someone who had died from childbed fever, and then he got very sick himself and died. Semmelweis studied the pathologist's symptoms and noticed that he had died from the same thing as the woman he had autopsied. This was actually a revelation in itself. Childbed fever wasn't something only women in childbirth got sick from. It was something other people in the hospital could get sick from as well. This still didn't answer his original question, but by now you can tell he's getting kind of close. The big difference between the doctor's ward and the midwife's ward at this point, after eliminating the birthing orientation of back versus side and the priest as well, was that the doctors and the medical students were doing autopsies while the midwives were not. So Semmelweis hypothesized that there were cadaverous particles, little pieces of corpse, that students were getting on their hands from the cadavers they were dissecting. And when they delivered the babies, those particles would get inside the woman who would develop the disease and die. Kind of gross, right? He wasn't far off, though. He was essentially describing disease and pathogens, just using different terminology. Anyways, if his hypothesis was correct, getting rid of those cadaverous particles should cut down on the death rate of childbed fever. So he ordered the medical staff to start cleaning their hands and instruments not just with soap, but with chlorine, which we know is a very powerful disinfectant. He didn't know that, though. He didn't know about germs. He literally just chose chlorine because he thought it would be the best way to get rid of any smell left behind. So kind of using the wrong formula, but still somehow solving the math problem. And as you can guess, when he started this, the rate of childbed fever dropped dramatically. You think everyone was thrilled, right? He solved the problem. They weren't. This is kind of human nature, too. For one thing, doctors were mad because it made it look like they were the idiots giving childbed fever to the women. Even though that was the case, they didn't like looking bad. Also, Semmelweis wasn't very tactful. He publicly berated people who disagreed with him. And so that's the 1800s, learning to wash our hands before we do surgery. So, as you can see, a better understanding of hygiene and the transmission of microbes has since contributed substantially to public health. It's amazing how much of a difference just washing our hands can make. This is kind of, I guess, a public endorsement, just wash your hands. Disease was still common and impacted life expectancy. There was several different things like parasites, typhoid, infections like rheumatic fever, scarlet fever. They were all common during the 1800s still. And so here we can see life expectancy for women over time. From basically 1480 to 1679, you're looking at roughly just less than 50 years. And this is the life expectancy of women at 15 years old. Remember, when they are previous to 15 years, that's they have that threat of disease, injury, and accidents. 15-year-olds were still younger children, which were much more prone to death to those previously mentioned threats. So that's why we're doing the 15-year method, I guess, if you want to call it that. And then it steadily increased as time went on and more advancements were made, which kind of just makes sense, right? And then in 1989, where this list cuts off, we're almost at 80 years for women. So in the 1800s, life expectancy at birth was 33 years for women and 31 years for men. Today it is 83.5 years and 79.5 years respectively. And this is actually, as I said, the life expectancy at birth. It's not looking at life expectancy at 15 years anymore. In both cases, women live about 5% longer than men. Sorry, guys. So why do women live longer? Really, why? There's some theories, but as far as I know, there's nothing definitive. Maybe us men are more likely to just do something stupid, like try to catch a firework with our bare hands or drive a car off a ramp or something. I'm only partly joking there. The male sex hormone testosterone has been found to be associated with risky behaviors, which has probably surprised absolutely nobody listening to this presentation. Likewise, maybe a woman's hormones may offer benefits. Estrogen, the female sex hormone, has been shown to have an antioxidant role. There's even been evidence that estrogen can prevent the kind of DNA damage that leads to disease. So why would evolution confer these advantages to women and not men as well? As I said, this is all pretty speculative, but maybe it has to do with the female's role as a child rearer. To be blunt and maybe a little crass, once the children are born, men are kind of disposable, right? From an evolutionary point of view anyway. The woman, however, is still important to raising the child, however. So in the modern world, there's a feeling that medical science can achieve anything. In the medieval world, there was a belief that only miracles were so powerful. I'm not sure if I'm making this up or not, but there's also something to be said along the lines of today's magic is tomorrow's science. Today, we believe that with enough time, energy, and resources put into medical science, we can achieve anything, right? I remember reading some sort of news article the other day about research being done to prevent or even reverse aging. That might seem like witchcraft or crazy talk to some of you listening, but think about something we know more about, like the vaccines we take for different diseases, or something as complicated as a heart transplant. Try to explain that to a person from the medieval world. It's going to sound like witchcraft or crazy talk to them. In earlier centuries, geez, let me just take a quick drink of my water here. In earlier centuries, the main hurdle to living a full and healthy life for men was making it through early childhood. For women, it was making it past childbearing age. And we'll go over that again in a quick moment. However, by the time the 13th century boy had reached 20, he could hope to live to be 45, and if he made it to 30, he had a good chance of making it into his 50s. The main threats lay in early childhood as the child's immune system, as I've explained kind of earlier before, was coming to terms with the threats posed by a disease-ridden environment. Lack of sanitation meant germs that are now easily dealt with lived everywhere. Thatched roofs, which were common in the countryside, where 85 to 90% of the population lived, because not everybody was living in castles or, big stone manors, they attracted insects and rodents. They carried bacteria, which they deposited either on the inhabitants or the food they would eat. Most care consisted of attention and prayer, because again, we didn't really have any of those medical technologies or breakthroughs yet. As I said back when I was telling you that story about Semmelweis, up until the 1800s, they still didn't really even use scientific reasoning for their medical research. A lot of it was thinking it was bad spirits or bad air. So attention and prayer was really their go-to. There was no plumbing, as I said. So human waste was just deposited outside, not too far away from the house, because who wants to be lugging a shovel, or not a shovel, like a bucket full of poop, miles away? Such material produced a breeding ground to the biggest killers of the period, which were cholera and typhoid, which were caused by unsanitary living conditions. Cholera is a nasty, nasty, nasty disease that causes such extreme bouts of diarrhea that your body actually just sometimes dies from dehydration. One of the actual methods of curing somebody of cholera besides antibiotics is just pumping them full of water to keep them hydrated. Typhoid causes a plethora of symptoms, including fevers, headaches, fatigue, muscle aches, sweating, dry cough, weight loss, loss of appetite, diarrhea, or constipation. It's kind of your catch-all disease. Meanwhile, typhus was spread by body lice living on infected people. Typhus is a rough one too, because it causes fevers, headaches, and rashes, which The rash is probably the big giveaway, but fevers and headaches alone probably won't really stand out too much compared to everything else. What typhus eventually does, though, is it eventually infects and inflames your brain. And this is what it usually causes death. Young men, as you can imagine back in that day, were generally involved in manual labor, and this led to an increased risk of death as a result of accidents at work. This also meant that any man who reached the end of his working life at around 40 would have a good chance of living to a decent age. Young women were quite different for the early centuries. For women, it was different. On average, they had a 10% better chance of surviving their first 10 years than men. But after that, between ages of 14 and 40, the years of having children, a woman's life expectancy was half that of a man's. One reason offered for this is that having babies in the Middle Ages was more dangerous than going to war. If that story didn't explain why, this extra stuff here will. Antenatal care and midwife knowledge was certainly less than it is now. Childbirth was less sanitary, and it put the mother at a high risk of fatal infection. Complications in the birth were more frequently fatal too, as although midwives existed, they had little medical knowledge and their hygiene was poor. No one understood the relationship between hygiene and childbirth. So what about our life expectancy now? Advancements of the present day now have the UK Office of National Statistics placing a woman's life expectancy at birth at 81 years, an advantage maintained at all ages now that childbirth is just less risky in general. Some diseases were less prevalent than they are now, however, and environmental health risks such as industrial pollution or passive smoking simply did not exist. Cancer, for example, was largely a disease of the elderly, a small group in the early centuries of this millennium. Cancer percentages of all ages and types has doubled from 1990 to present day. So doubled, as I said, in 30 years. The doubling itself should not be seen necessarily as a bad thing, though. The important statistic to look to as far as cancer is concerned in this case is the cancer survival. Has that increased or decreased? And the answer is that cancer survival has also doubled. One reason for the doubling is due to an increase in our technology, which allows us to test and find more. It's also responsible for why survival has increased as well. As for the doubling of cancer prevalence, it's the old adage of you just don't know what you don't know. There was likely just as much cancer back in the 1990s, and before then even, we just didn't have the capabilities to discover it. So here we can see our population growth, and as this chart very adequately demonstrates, you can see the population explosion that happens in the modern era. So I do enjoy some of the titles that they give. Old Stone Age, New Stone Age commences the New Stone Age. Bronze Age, Iron Age, Middle Ages. You have our Black Death right in here. You can see the little blip down. But overall, you can see that there is that slow, almost painstakingly slow, gradual increase of our population. And then the giant explosion in the modern age. And this is what caused it, the Industrial Era or Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain in the late 1700s. Many of the first innovations that enabled the Industrial Revolution began in the textile industry. Britain also had plenty of coal and iron, which was important to power and make machines for the factories. Most important are the resources available. Power, both economic and political, was starting to rise to the forefront in developed countries. The Industrial Revolution, the United States was also obviously involved with it. They weren't far behind. And they started with many new inventions such as the assembly line. So think about how important the assembly line was. Yes, it was likely a terribly boring job, but allowed for mass production of goods since parts could just be put on a belt and moved along effortlessly to the next station in line. So here I'm just showing that industrialization is a process of economic and social change. It is one that shifts the economic activity onto the focus of work, wages, and income. Generally speaking, industrialization also means changing an economy from a primarily agricultural-based one to one based on manufacturing goods. Individual manual labor is replaced by mechanized mass production, and craftsmen are usually replaced by those assembly lines that were invented. There are 7 factors of an industrialization. You have your natural resources. Natural resources are obviously important because you obviously need the right materials, the raw materials to manufacture anything, right? Capital refers to you needing a way to pay for the production of goods. A stable currency is important for this. Workers are needed to make the goods. Having a high birth rate helps with this, particularly since occupational health and safety probably didn't really exist at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Technology was important to provide better ways to make more and better goods. The assembly line is a good example of this. Consumers to use what you're manufacturing, otherwise, honestly, what's the point? Transportation was important to get the goods out of the manufacturing facility and to those customers. And then finally, the government support is important because it's great for developing policy and shaping trade deals with other countries to increase your productivity and success. So the Industrial Revolution, of the many factors that led to the Industrial Revolution, two of the biggest and most significant were the Embargo Act of 1807 and the War of 1812. This is not going to become a history lesson, but I want to merely emphasize the significant changes that affected our population boom. Okay? So the Embargo Act of 1807. So essentially, the Napoleonic War was, to be brief, France and their allies against a bunch of European states. As you can imagine, based on the name, Napoleon was the leader of the French Empire at this time. So Britain's Navy opened fire when they weren't allowed to search one of America's ships. At the time, America was neutral in this war. They had no stake in the war, but despite protests, Britain continued. Later on, they resorted to impressment, forcing American sailors into their army. Thomas Jefferson issued the Embargo of 1807 as a general embargo, restricting trade with all foreign countries, particularly Britain and France. So there's impressment, just a nice little comic of it. Refers to the act in which men were captured and forced into naval service. The embargo kind of did the exact opposite. So Thomas Jefferson probably had a little bit of egg on his face at the end of this. Britain and France's economies continued without any problems. They were unaffected by the embargo entirely. But the United States, on the other hand, was devastated. Its economy suffered. There was high unemployment, there was bankruptcy, there was loss of profits. This lack of trade from this embargo with foreign countries limited their lives because they had to live without many foreign products. With no foreign goods, the people of the United States had to resort to other options, such as producing their own goods. So each country has to access different types of resources like coal, iron, lumber, making them independently strong compared to countries that did not have such resources available. And then finally, there's the War of 1812. So the War of 1812, very, very, very briefly, the U.S. declared war on Great Britain and its allies in British North America, which is basically Canada, over tensions based on territorial expansion. So many factors pressed the United States into war, but the main takeaway, was the lack of resources necessary to become independent and not pushed around by other countries, especially Britain at the time. The restructuring was basically inevitable. This forced the states into the Industrial Revolution, along with Canada following much later. Obviously much later, because Canada wasn't even a country until 1867. Overall, this was the effect of the Industrial Revolution. Most people lived in the slum. Imagine this, okay? So you have 5 to 9 people living in a single room, which is basically as big as an apartment. Not only was there not enough room, but more people were getting sick as well. Because everyone lived in terrible conditions and they were so close to one another, these diseases spread rapidly, and the lack of medicine and medical care resulted in many deaths. At the time, the population was increasing rapidly because of more people moving in, so apartments became more and more crowded and just in worse condition. This was the beginning of capitalism, and people now had to compete for jobs to survive, leading to poverty and the horrible living conditions. What was originally an agricultural way of life had now become an urban jungle of overcrowdedness and diseases. This created limits to population growth once again, because you couldn't continue the population growing if everybody was packed in like sardines, getting sick and then dying. So as mentioned at the beginning of this little section, the Industrial Revolution began its origins in Britain, which flowed into the United States shortly after. It would take much longer, late 19th century, for Canada and other countries to follow suit. The first noticeable change was in economic and social activities were transformed from agricultural and natural resource extraction to manufacturing and services. Second, the economic and social activities shifted from rural cottage industries to urban industrial pursuits of a larger scale. It also marked the shift from feudalism to capitalism and from agriculture to manufacturing and services. So, feudalism is basically a combination of legal and military customs in medieval Europe that flourished between the 9th and 15th centuries. Broadly defined, it's a way of structuring society around relationships derived from the holding of land in exchange for service or labor. So, here's a quick little kind of triangle that kind of shows how it works. You might recall if you watched Game of Thrones, I'm not going to talk about the last season or anything, that one of the characters, Bronn, was always pressed to do something with the promise of a castle as a reward. That's basically feudalism. Do me a solid, and I'll give you a castle and all of its accompanying land and people. So feudalism was the political and military system of the Middle Ages. In a feudal society, land is exchanged for military service and loyalty. The ownership of land was the basis of power. So if you owned the castle, you owned the land, and I mean, it wasn't slavery, but you almost kind of owned the people that lived on that land. I think you could extract taxes from them. So now we get to the modern day population. The world population is growing by approximately 74 million people per year. That's actually, so this is how, there's 31,536,000 seconds in a year. So think about it this way. There's basically 2 or more babies being born every second. So that's like how many babies just being born. Like it's every second 2 or more babies. But population growth is not evenly distributed across the globe. Scientists are yet to conclusively determine the human carrying capacity of Earth. What can Earth actually manage to hold and supply for, essentially? Population is only one of many factors influencing the environment. We have consumed more resources in the last 50 years than the whole of humanity before us. Our needs have grown, our wants have grown. We are a society, a consumer-based society now that basically just, without lack of a better word, almost just takes what they want. The 20th century saw the biggest increase in the world's population in human history. So, as it stands now, the population stands at around 7 billion people. It's estimated that this population in 2050 will be 9.3 billion. This means that in less than 4 decades, we could be adding almost twice the number of people living in China to the Earth's population. So the question becomes, is there too many of us? Is there too few? I mean, I know it says it right there, but you gotta have to think to yourself too, maybe there is too many of us. So, if you source out different charts and projections of world population increases, depending on where you go, so in this case, world population on UN or on the Deutsche Bank, you'll find many people saying it's going to keep growing or it's actually going to start decreasing. Each of us depends on the Earth's life support systems for food, for shelter, clean water and air, energy, and other vital resources such as wood, iron, and aluminum. We must have ample amounts to grow. This is part of the reason why the first couple chapters we talked about briefly, biodiversity and ecology, are so important. If these systems collapse, then where do our life support systems go? In a more extreme and broader sense, if all of the trees were to disappear, where is our oxygen coming from? Strong and growing scientific evidence that we are degrading our life support system with a rapidly growing ecological footprint. If the planet can continue to maintain our population and sustain us, we will grow. But can our planet continue to maintain and sustain us? So what limits the growth of all living things on the planet? Just an open-ended question for you guys to think about. There is one thing that I will talk about in terms of what limits populations. There is an interesting case study that we're going to go over pretty briefly here. There was a study of population control was shown of reindeer on an isolated island in the Bering Sea. As you can see from this chart here, population ended up not doing too well. So the reindeer was introduced to St. Matthew Island in 1944. It increased from 29 animals at that time to 6,000 in the summer of 1963. and then it underwent a giant crash die-off the following winter to less than 50 animals. There's only 42. So what happened? Due to a high birth rate and low mortality, they prospered in population rapidly. By 1965, the density of the reindeer on the island had increased to a herd of approximately 6,000. They had no predators. They had all the prey or plants that they could ever want. So, of course, the population just exploded, right? The lichens and mosses that they ate during the winter, they're basically the significant portion of their winter diet, however, had been completely eliminated due to the population explosion. As a result, sedges and grasses were expanding into the sites previously occupied by the lichens so that they just couldn't regrow. By the time the winter of 1963 happened, in association with extreme snow accumulation, which would cover up the sedges and grasses, which don't really grow much in the winter, the deer had nothing, and basically the entire population of 6,000 reindeer died of starvation. It's easy to think about that you could reach that threshold essentially very easily and without realizing it, where everything seems fine. Like in the winter of 1962, the deer were fine, but then 1963 happened and they all died, except for 42 of them. And funny enough, with one known exception, all of the surviving reindeer, all of them were female. The pattern of reindeer population growth and die-off has been observed on other island situations with introduced animals and is believed to be a product of the limited development of ecosystems and the associated deficiency of potential population regulating factors on islands. Food supply, through its interaction with climatic factors, was the main contribution to population regulating for reindeer on St. Matthew Island. There are other methods of population regulating. I'm not going to go into them at the moment. That's probably going to be a topic for another day, or just food for thought for you to think about on your own time. So, although humans have the ability to foresee problems, unlike the reindeer, we are still capable of overstepping our impact on the planet if it's not regulated globally. I also don't want to be a downer or anything, but we as humans are also famous for ignoring a problem until it's right in our face. Anyone here remember the worries about the ozone layer depletion? More recently, we can look to climate change or even COVID. As a species, we do tend to be more reactive than proactive, and hopefully courses like this and just our future generations can start to think about that proactiveness to take action earlier instead of reacting to something later. It's also been proven time and time again that being proactive is actually monetarily smarter, and you spend less money being proactive and preparing for something as opposed to being reactive and having to fix a problem after the fact. And kind of easy way of thinking about it is building flood barriers. If you build the flood barrier, that costs you, I don't know how much money, but it's probably a lot less than having to fix all of the buildings and all the infrastructure that would get ruined if a flood came through and flooded a downtown area. So, the population of the world grew by 50% from 1900 to 1950, and then increased by 200% over the next 50 years to reach 6 billion just before the turn of the 21st century. Even with fertility declining and a slower rate of population growth in most countries, the United Nations predicts a global population of about 9 billion in 2050, eventually stabilizing at about 10 billion over the next century. Elon Musk is going to have to get a move on so we can start shuttling people off to the moon or Mars, because that's a lot of people. So, large numbers such as these tend to dull the senses and reveal the absolutely amazing progress of humankind during the 20th century. So, here we can see modern day population growth. It's got a chart, shows all these different countries. Not a lot of them, but just a few. We got China, India, the US, Indonesia, Brazil, Pakistan, and Nigeria. So China has the largest population, which is probably not a surprise to many of you, with approximately 1.4 billion people. Next is India, close behind at 1.3 billion. As for growth rates, China and Africa show the largest increases. And of course, some of these are just, predictions, right? Because we're, again, not living in 2050 or the year 2100. So after a century with 2 world wars, the Holocaust, a Cold War, which was the first realization that world destruction was possible, failed experiment of communist regimes, spread of HIV and AIDS, to name only a few of the 20th century horrors, I mean, unfortunately, I could go on, may seem ironic to speak of progress in modern times with increasing population worldwide. Overall, it seems we can talk about as many advancements in society as catastrophic failures. An interesting note, though, you've probably seen this in like movies or books or even just things you've come across, but wars themselves seem to be a catalyst for advancing technology at a stupidly faster rate, which is part of the reason why with the 2 world wars that we had, there was such a dramatic increase in or dramatic change in how our lives were lived. So most of the world grew largely in countries like China, India, and the United States. Unsurprisingly, China and India, 2 countries with 2 of the largest populations, right? Canada's population growth continued to be slow through the First World War, the Great Depression, and the Second World War, after which growth rates began to increase again. Today, Canada's population growth is pretty dependent on international migration rather than national birth rates. To put it a little in perspective, Canada's fertility rate as of 2019 was 1.47 births per woman. The US was 1.7 and India was 2.2 births per woman. Basically, what that's indicating is that on average, a woman in the US or a woman in India are going to have more children than a woman in Canada. The world's annual population growth is unevenly distributed between poorer and richer countries, and the UN projects that this gap will widen over time. So, at first glance, what do you think this means? Do you think the richer countries are having more or the poorer countries are having more? Maybe the answer will surprise you. And I know you guys can't answer me. I'm just pausing for dramatic effect. So during 2012, only 1 out of every 80 infants was born in one of the world's more developed or highly industrialized countries, where the average level of income per person and rate of consumption are relatively high. So to put it in layman's terms, 1 out of every 80 infants were born in a developed country like the United States, or in like a country in Europe like Germany or Britain. The other 79 were born in poorer, less developed countries. So as it says, the other 79 were added to the world's less developed countries with lower average levels of income and low rates of consumption and impacts on the planet. About 82% of the world's people live in less developed countries with overcrowded, poverty-stricken areas. Why? The populations of countries, cities, states, and other defined areas grow or shrink as a result of 3 factors. You have births, you have deaths, and you have migration. So, without taking migration into account, it is easy to see that when births are greater than the number of deaths in a particular time period, population is going to grow. If you have 100 people born and 3 people die, that means you've gained 97 people. The reverse is also true when deaths exceed births. If you have 5 births but you have 100 deaths, you've lost 95 people. With the ever-increasing life expectancy rate continuing to rise due to health awareness, healthcare advancements, it seems the death rate lowers as a consequence. As well, we see an overall birth expectancy rate increase due to the same factors in healthcare. The third factor of migration adds a twist to a country's population overall. Migration is the movement of people from one place to another, whether it be moving into a place or leaving it. Canada has been slow to populate and relies on migration as a necessary way to keep population up and economy strong. The current population of Canada is about 37 million as of Monday, January 14th, 2019, based on the latest United Nations estimates. Canada population is equivalent to 0.48% of the total world population, which doesn't seem like a lot. 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the US border, leaving a large part of the country void of any population. So here's a map of Canada, and it's even got the little persons per square kilometer. As you can see, there's large sections which are sparsely populated. Dark red colors are highly populated, as in people per greater or equal to 50 people per square kilometer. So unsurprisingly, you're seeing that more towards the border with the States, as was indicated. It's very, very much indicated right along, where Vancouver and Victoria are, and especially in Toronto. So a vast country of extreme climates makes Canada difficult to overpopulate. If you were to think about it in terms of getting that like greater than or equal 50 people per square kilometer throughout the entire country, that you can imagine would be very difficult to do. But part of the thing is that a lot of these places are pretty extreme in climates. There's probably never, I can't see the day, but I don't want to say for sure because who knows with scientific technologies, but I don't see the day where we would have, a very dense populated area way up north in the Arctic Circle, basically. Here's an example of India's population density map, which kind of is in stark contrast to Canada's, right? Look at the people per square kilometer legend here. Their lowest one is 15 to 50, which was basically the greatest one for Canada, right? The greatest one was 50 for Canada. We get into areas right along the border here where India's got basically 1,000 to 1,500 or 1,500 to 12,000 per square kilometer. How insane is 12,000 people per square kilometer? Can you even imagine that? People are like, it's nuts. So the fertility rate of women, coming back to Canada, however, is the fertility rate of women aged 35 to 39 years continued to rise to 56 births per 1,000 years per 1,000 women in 2016. It has been higher than the fertility rate of women aged 20 to 24 years since 2010, which has been falling over time. People are just waiting longer to have children, if at all. Basically, what this is indicating is that it's basically saying that women aged 35 to 39 are more likely to have children than women aged 20 to 24. So people are waiting longer to have children. There are several possible explanations for that. People are staying and getting longer educations. You have more people going and getting their masters or getting their PhDs or going back for a second degree. There's secondary schools like teachers college. There's medical doctors college, medical school, like all that stuff, right? There's culture changes. There's inflation. I don't know about you guys, but seeing the price of groceries lately is a little ridiculous. There's even stuff like just women being in the workforce now, right? Now too. So having more women in the workforce compared to, even 30 or 40 years ago, is just putting both out, like having the man and the woman both in the workforce. I've lost my train of thought entirely. Having women in the workforce has caused it where it's a good thing, but having them in the workforce as well has prevented potentially people from having children because there's nobody at home to take care of the child sometimes. And of course, there's even more reasons. Yet in Africa, the young females are expected to have 10 children during their fertile years. This is expected to be offset by the mortality rate of children under 10. So these graphs show how the population is growing or stopped growing in certain countries. Canada is growing at a slow but steady rate, but it's not quick enough to keep up to the old age pensions of the aging baby boomers. So on the left one here, you can see there's rapid growth. There's a lot of people in the ages 0 to 14, in the 15 to 44, and then not nearly as many that are like not super old. 45 is not super old, but in the older bracket. Versus Australia, Canada, and the United States, which have a decent distribution, but there's obviously quite a bit of people in that grouping of the 45 to 85. And then you have zero growth, where essentially if you were to cut out the 45 to 85, this group probably couldn't actually take over all the stuff left behind by them. Essentially meaning there'd be like jobs open. So Canadians, as I kind of mentioned, are having fewer children. The average fertility in the United States was 2.0 children per woman compared with 1.6 in Canada, according to Statistics Canada in May 7th, 2017. One expert believes that skyrocketing housing costs, coupled with slow wage growth and also a decline in job security, have led many Canadians to believe they just simply can't afford to start a family. I happened to buy my first house actually just last May, which might sound like a humble brag, but considering it was right in the middle of the madness when houses started selling for ridiculous amounts, consider it more of a warning. So, what was the reason for the skyrocketing housing costs? Largely COVID. Using our area as an example, people living in Toronto began being able to work from home. And if you've ever lived in Toronto, then you know how expensive Toronto can be. You can sell your shack that you're living in and get at least $1 million for it, probably. So they'd sell their place in Toronto and be able to buy whatever place they wanted in Barrie or the surrounding area instead, because they were buying it with Toronto money, essentially. They were buying it at higher prices, which increased the price of houses in Barrie. It's rather unfortunate. I don't recommend. So the yearly cost of raising a child is $13,366, which adds up to just over $240,000 over 18 years. The four biggest costs are childcare, housing, transportation, and food, according to Money Sense. So, is this how we control population globally? Will the population of the world continue to rise at an astounding rate, or will it plateau or even decrease over time like the reindeer on St. Matthew Island? Personally, I hope it doesn't decrease like the reindeer on St. Matthew Island, because that would actually just be catastrophic. Can population rise continue? Even with renewable sources of energy and materials, there would have to be an eventual duel between continued population growth and a finite world. But the collision may be averted because population growth has been slowing in recent decades, not from rising mortality, because of voluntary controls on fertility, which is potentially due to those previously mentioned icons of skyrocketing housing costs, low wage growth, and decline in job security. Again, there are links if you want to read up on any of that stuff. But will that be enough? And that basically takes us to the end of this presentation. So next week, we're going to be discussing the Montreal Protocol and the ODP. Remember, if you want to find out what the ODP is, you're going to have to stay tuned for next week. Remember, another brief reminder that your first video quiz for the 11th hour is due by midnight tonight. There will be a discussion board up linked again if you have any questions you'd like me to address for next week. And again, I will be hosting my first office hours on Monday, January 24th from 7 to 9 p.m. There is a link to a Word document at the bottom of the weekly learning section where you can book a time slot to meet with me. I hope you enjoyed this week's presentation. And as always, please reach out to me with anything, whatever method, anything you have questions about, whatever method you want to use is most comfortable for you with any questions you may have. So until next week, stay safe out there, stay warm, stay classy.